The following audio is from Maple City Baptist Church in Chatham, Ontario. For more information about Maple City, please visit us online at maplecitybaptistchurch.com.
I invite you to turn your Bibles this evening to Matthew chapter 16. And again, we're going to be in a very familiar story. We've been going through Peter's life for the last couple lessons, and we're continuing that this evening. It's kind of like either a really long introduction to 1 Peter or a mini-series on Peter's life. So whatever you feel better about. If you like mini-series, it's a mini-series. Yeah. If you like introductions, like I do, then this is your thing. This past week, I was reading through the text we'll be in this evening, and I kept thinking about what it is like to be a parent. And so if I was in a room full of parents and I made this statement, then I think I would get a lot of parents wholeheartedly agreeing with me. If I said, children are such a blessing from the Lord, I think I'd have a lot of parents that would say, amen, that is true. Children are wonderful. They're a blessing from the Lord. But if I made in the same group of parents the statement, raising children is a very, very, very difficult calling, then the same group of people would say, it absolutely is. It's a blessing from the Lord, and it's a very difficult calling. We had a situation a few weeks back, and where I'm going with this is that there are times that it's just wonderful to be a parent, and you look out, and they're just doing the right thing. It feels like it's just working out, and you're just so grateful that God has given you this privilege. And there are other times you're like, oh, I'd like to dig a hole and be in it for a while. And so a few weeks ago, we were at a volleyball tournament, and we were in the middle of a game. I think we were losing the game, so it probably was actually good timing, but we were losing this game. And some kid, pulled the fire alarm. And so it's a school, it's the high school, Sika High School, and there's 4 courts that are being used, full of people watching, and it's just the one big tournament of the year that we have for our volleyball league. And so this is a terrible setback. For a while, we decided to keep playing. We thought somebody would just call the fire alarm. Turns out, the kid was mine. I know. Shocking, right? Miles had pulled the fire alarm, and I guess it's partially our fault because we're trying to be watching a game where there's no stands, and so what the parents do is there's a little doorway area, and the parents kind of form a line, and they sit in front of the doorway so that no kids can get out, and so the kids are stuck in this 4x6 small area, and there's 8 or 10 or 15 kids in this little area. And so there was a fire alarm there. I guess one of them was bound to pull it, and Miles decided to be him. And so we all had to exit the school, and fire trucks came, and it was awful. It was embarrassing. We had this little hope because somebody said, oh, I think somebody else pulled the fire alarm in the other room, which was, why would we ever think that could be the case? Oh, Miles and the other kid pulled it at the same time. But it wasn't the other kid. It was Miles. And just this past week, I got a call to let me know that the bill for pulling the fire alarm would be coming my way for the fire trucks coming out, which I didn't know would happen. I didn't know that was a thing. And so, great time to be a parent. Children are a blessing from the Lord, right? They are, sometimes. Anyways, as I was reading this story that we'll be getting into this evening, I wonder if these are some of the same emotions that Jesus felt as he discipled these 12 men. Times where it was just this wonderful thing that they were getting it, and it seemed like it was going well, and it's like, look at these 12 fishermen and men of different occupation who were kind of like a ragtag group becoming these men of God who understand who I am and who are going to go out and change the world. And then other times where it's like, where have you been for the last 3 years? What are you doing? How do you not get this at this time? I think Jesus probably had these emotions, hey, everything's great. And in our story this evening, we will see that range of emotion, I think, that Jesus would have gone through. At times they got it, at times they had absolutely no clue. At times they were there and they were ready to do whatever was necessary, and at other times they could not stay with him in his hour of greatest need. Peter left his net to follow Jesus. And 3 years later, after seeing all of his miracles and hearing all of his teaching, he denied Jesus in front of a little girl. And you know what's funny about this? Is that this is the process of discipleship for all of us. This isn't just Peter who goes through this roller coaster. It's not just Peter who at times is making these wonderful proclamations of Christ's deity and his mission and being willing to do whatever it takes, and then at other times falling completely flat in his face. It's all of us. And so Peter's life is such an encouragement to us, and I think there are some lessons in this story that are applicable to our lives as well. And so tonight we'll be in Matthew chapter 16. We'll be reading verses 13 to 26, and we have a lot of ground to cover. There is much that can be said about these verses, much that has been said. There are many, many different opinions. In fact, you might say that some of these verses are the most hotly debated verses in all of the New Testament. And so my personality would be to spend a lot of time on those verses. I'm going to do my best not to, because, to be honest with you, where I want to land tonight is, how is Jesus discipling Peter, and what does that have to do with us today? So that's where I'm going. That's what I want you to focus on. But having said that, we will scratch the surface of some of these issues as we go through the verses. And so let's get into our passage in Matthew chapter 16. Leading up to this, Jesus has recently completed his final tour of preaching and healing in Galilee. So he will not be going back to Galilee for ministry again. He's finished his ministry there, and he begins to set his sights on all of the regions surrounding Galilee. Which is interesting because the regions surrounding Galilee were not very Jewish. They were primarily Gentile. And so Jesus begins to look to these Gentile places to start sharing the message of repentance and sharing the gospel and what he's come to do, doing miracles and sharing who he was. And so he's been to Tyre and Sidon, he's gone into Decapolis, now he's crossed over into Bethsaida, and he's about to head north, about as north as he goes in his ministry, to Caesarea Philippi. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, it says, "When Jesus came into the coast of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, 'Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?'" Who am I? Now, it is, I think, significant that he has just come to Caesarea Philippi. Okay? Caesarea Philippi is about 40 kilometers north of the Sea of Galilee. It is a very unique city. In the Old Testament, it was dedicated to the worship of Baal. So this region, this area, there was a city that was just dedicated completely to the worship of Baal. In the 4th century, it was captured by the Greeks, and it was renamed Peneus. And Peneus is the center of worship for the Greek god Pan. And Pan was the god of farming, of fields, of mountains, of shepherds, of flocks. So this city goes from being dedicated to Baal worship to now being dedicated to, and even renamed, Peneus, which is for the Greek god Pan. And then when the Romans conquered, it became a place where imperial worship was very common. So what I'm saying is you have this city who has only ever been dedicated to worshiping false gods. Baal, Pan, and now the emperor. It's renamed Caesarea Philippi in honor of Caesar Augustus and in honor of, actually, Philip the Tetrarch, who was Tetrarch at this time, is the man who renamed it, and it was in honor of himself. And so he thought, I'll give Caesar Augustus some credit here. I'll tag his name to it, but I'm also going to make sure my name gets on it too. And so that's where we get this city from. A very heathen, a very idolatrous city. This is the city where the Jordan River began, and if you were kind of walking up toward the city, you would see the Jordan River where it begins. You'd see huge cliffs, and then as you walk up, you would see idols and places to sacrifice and to worship false gods carved into the rock. So carved into these rock cliffs, there would be areas you could go and worship gods. There would be statues. There would be all that stuff. So it was very clearly an idolatrous city. And so he's standing beneath the idols of so-called Pan, carved into a cliffside, and he knew that the timing was right to settle this question. Who do men say that I am? So verse 14, they answer him, and they said, "Some say thou art John the Baptist, some Elias, others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." And what's interesting about these answers is that, in a sense, they are all good answers. I mean, they're all positive answers, right? It would almost be as though Jesus is asking the question, and the disciples are going, okay, what's Jesus getting at? Like, is he kind of frustrated? Is he sad? Is he walking up to the city, seeing how wicked it is, and he just needs like a pick-me-up? And so maybe if we give him some good answers, then he'll be happy. And so they say, well, Jesus, people really like you. They say that you're like John the Baptist. John the Baptist was very popular. Everybody saw him as a messenger from God. Or maybe you're like Elijah. What a wonderful prophet to be compared to. Or Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets. Whatever it is, Jesus, people recognize that you speak for God, that you are from God, that the works that you do are of God. And so, in one sense, it seems like the people are at least understanding somewhat of who Jesus is. They understand that he is from God, that he is one of God's mouthpieces. And so each of these titles is very complimentary, but each of these titles is grossly inadequate. These are the titles that the vast majority of religions today would give Jesus. You're like one of the prophets. He was a mouthpiece of God. He was a great teacher. They all fell so short of who Jesus was. And so they asked this question, and I think maybe they thought they were giving a positive answer, but they weren't. Because that's not who Jesus is. He is not a prophet. Right? He was not just a mouthpiece of God. He's God in the flesh. And so verse 15, Jesus turns his attention from the popular culture, popular opinion, to these individuals. He said unto them, "But whom say ye that I am? Who do you think that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And I think this would be one of the moments for Jesus when he smiles. He's just so excited to hear Peter get it. Look at his answer. You're the Christ. You're the Messiah that was promised. You're the one that Israel had been waiting for. You're the one that will take the throne of David. You are the Christ. Not just the Son of God, which is something they've already said in Matthew chapter 14. Certainly, you're deity, but you're the Son of the living God. And I kind of picture Peter looking around at all these false gods and saying, you're the Son of the one that's alive, of the real God. You're the Christ, the Messiah. What an exciting statement for Peter to make. He, for the first time, unambiguously acknowledges Jesus as the Christ. This is a great day. This is a great turning point in Peter's life. And he is a spokesman here for the disciples. It seems like he's representing what they're all starting to believe. They're all starting to put these pieces together. And this might seem very obvious to us. Okay, we look back at the story and we go, okay, obviously Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. We know that. How did they not get it yet? But you got to remember, these men, they knew the Old Testament. They knew prophecies. They knew that the Son of Man would come. And they knew that there'd be a Messiah coming. But they really hadn't put all these pieces together. And when they understood Jesus was the Son of God, they didn't necessarily at this time understand that that meant he was also the Messiah, the one who would sit on David's throne. So they're trying to get this together. And finally, it seems like there's this revelation. It all makes sense. You're the Son of God who has come to be the one who is promised. Hey, it's all the same person, and you are him. And so it is a wonderful day. They're finally realizing just who Jesus really is. Verse 17, and Jesus answered and said unto him, Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood hath not revealed this unto thee, but my Father which is in heaven. And I just imagine the joy in Jesus' face as he looks at Peter and he says, Peter, you're so blessed. But look how quickly that Jesus gives God the credit for Peter's proclamation. You're blessed, Peter. And he says Simon Bar-Jonah, which means Simon, son of Jonas. Okay, so he's almost drawing a contrast here between you're the Christ, the Son of God. You are Peter. You're Simon, not Peter yet, but you're Simon, the son of Jonas. And so he's saying, you're just a man. Okay, you're the son. Your father's Jonas. And then he says so quickly, flesh and blood didn't reveal it to you. It's not something that man revealed. It's not something that you came by on your own. But my Father which is in heaven. It was God that revealed this to you. And I think he's very careful to do this because, number one, it keeps Peter humble. You understand that sometimes I think we get to this point where we understand something spiritually, And really, Peter could look around at his culture of the day and say, I know something about God, I know something about Jesus that nobody else gets. I mean, all the religious leaders, they're in the dark. They have no idea. Even these other people who think he's a prophet, they don't know. And Jesus said that I'm right. And so he's very careful very quickly to say, you know what, it was God that brought you to that point, Peter. God is the one that revealed it to you. And so I think it keeps Peter humble, but the other thing it does is that it keeps Peter hopeful. Because Peter can be hopeful that it's not just flesh and blood that does the revealing, and that as he goes out to try and tell people who Jesus is, that God will be revealing to them who he is. It is a positive thing as well. So Peter can say, Lord, I know I'm nothing special. God revealed this to me, but what's wonderful is neither is this guy. He's nothing special either. He doesn't need to be because it's God that does the revealing. And so it's humility and it's hopefulness. It is just amazing to me when you read Scripture how brilliant Jesus was and how he just, I know that's so obvious, but how he just always knew exactly the right thing to say to encourage, but also to straighten out and to keep us going in the right direction. So that's what he does here with Peter. Verse 18, and I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So the declaration here, you are Peter, parallels what Peter said, you are the Christ. And it's like Jesus is saying, since now you know who I really am, I'm going to tell you who you really are and what you're going to do. Upon this rock I will build my church. And this is the passage that is arguably one of the most debated verses in the New Testament. What does it mean? It's this dividing line between evangelical Protestantism and Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. It's like what you believe about this verse seems to dictate whether you're going to go to Roman Catholic Church or you're going to pick up a Protestant church of some kind. I don't think it needs to be that way, but it is true that the two main things that seem to divide those two churches is the method of salvation. Is it by grace through faith alone, or is it by grace and works that you're saved? And the second thing is authority, and that's what this verse deals with. Who is the ultimate authority? And so there are three primary ways to understand this verse. And very quickly, I want to give you what the three ways are and some of the reasons that people believe them. And so the first way is that the rock is Peter. Okay, so the question really is, what is the rock? What is he saying here? And the first group of people would say, well, I believe that Peter is the rock that Jesus is going to build the church on. The second group would say that the rock is Peter's confession. That the truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, is the rock. That confession is the truth, and upon that confession, Jesus will build his church. And the third group would say that the rock is an allegorical picture of the Gentiles. And this one probably needs a little bit of explaining, because remember the setting that they're in. They've just walked up to Caesarea Philippi. They're in a Gentile land. There's idols overlooking everything. And so some people will say it's upon this rock, and that maybe Jesus was pointing to a literal rock or to the city and saying it's upon this Gentile wickedness, this idolatry, that I will build the true church. And so those are the three pictures. I think it was Ray Vanderland that taught this in a Bible study that we had done in the past. And so there are people that have, I think, good points for at least the first two of these ideas. And so I want to give you a couple of the arguments for each, and I give you my opinion at the end. And so the first group would say the rock is Peter. And the reason for this is that it seems to be the most natural way of reading the sentence. Okay? You're Peter, the word Peter means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. I mean, if you were just to read that to your average Joe, most people would come up saying, yeah, okay, he's saying, you're the rock, and upon the rock I'm going to build my church. It's Peter. It's a very natural reading of the Scripture. Jesus goes on to explain what he meant. And so they'd say, well, it kind of makes sense that he's calling Peter the rock, because in the very next verse, Jesus explains what that means. He says in verse 19, and I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So they say, well, it seems like he's giving an explanation of what it means that Peter is the rock. And so that's another argument for Peter being the rock. Now, some people will counter their arguments and say, well, you know what? When Jesus is speaking to Peter, he says, thou art Peter, and the word is Petros, which is a masculine form of the word for rock. And then he says, and upon this Petra, which is the feminine form, I will build my church. And so then they argue, well, look, he's actually he's maybe making a play on words, but he's trying to make a distinction between Petros, who's Peter, and Petra, which is the rock that Jesus is going to build his church on. So they're trying to say it's distinct. And what this group would answer, they'd say, yes, it is true that he uses two different words, but he had to. In the Greek, he could not use the word Petra to refer to a name of a person. It had to be Petros. And so that would cancel out that argument. The second thing they would say is, it's very likely he was speaking in Hebrew or Aramaic here, and the word would have been the same, Kepha. And so if he was speaking in Aramaic when he said this, which is likely, then it's only when you translate it to Greek that you get the difference. Does that make sense? And so that maybe they would say canceled out that argument. The final argument that people would make in favor of the rock being Peter is that it does seem that Peter holds a very distinct and unique position within the church. He does hold a unique position in church history. If you're a Catholic, then you believe that he was the first pope. Very unique position. But if you're a Protestant, you also recognize that he is the one that was used at Pentecost to open the door of salvation to the Jews. And then again, he's the one, it was by his authority when he went to Samaria that the gospel was officially opened to the Samaritans. And in Acts chapter 10, he's the one that went to Cornelius, it's like the gospel being open, the doors of salvation being open to the Gentiles. And so he does hold a very unique position in the church. And all of these reasons, I think, give the rock being Peter pretty good credence. The second group would say that the rock is Peter's confession, that it's the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that is the rock. And they would argue that it is the single most important foundational truth of Christianity. There are a lot of foundational, essential truths in Christianity, but if you were going to have one truth that you had to pick as the most important one, I think it would probably be this one, right? Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of the living God. That covers a lot there. I mean, it deals directly with the identity of the one that we name ourselves by. And so it is a very foundational truth. Possibly the most foundational truth. And so that makes sense. The second thing it does is that it places the importance of the church on Jesus rather than Peter. And so when you say that it's on his confession, then the foundation isn't Peter. The foundation is Jesus. Okay? And so that's another reason. The final reason is that I think a lot of evangelical Protestants would say, well, Peter's not the first pope, therefore, number one can't be right. So Peter can't be the rock because Peter wasn't the first pope. And to be honest with you, I think this might be the line of reasoning that is the most influential among evangelical Protestants. I think that this influences a lot of us because we want to fight against the idea that Peter's the pope. And so by believing that it's the confession is the rock rather than Peter, then it supports our view best. So that's another line of reasoning. The final one is that it's an allegory for the Gentiles. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but they would just say that Jesus is surveying the city of wickedness and proclaiming that is on this foundation that he would build his church. Okay, and the only big problem I have with that final one is that there's no indication in the text that they're even looking at a rock. There's no indication that they're overlooking the city. Now, they've gone to the city, and it's a very beautiful picture of Jesus overlooking the city or looking at the idolatry, but it's actually not there in the text. And so I don't think we can defend that one very well. So here's my opinion. And it's not the same as it was for a long time. Okay? My opinion is I think Peter is the rock. I think Peter is the rock, and I believe that the reason that I have pushed against it, and I believe the reason that most of evangelical Christians that believe that it's the confession push against this is because of our fear about how this verse can be misused rather than what the verse actually means, if Peter's the rock. What I'm saying is, I believe Peter is the rock, and that does not mean that Peter's the Pope. Okay? It doesn't have to. And I believe that if there wasn't for a large group of people proclaiming that this verse declares Peter as the Pope, if it wasn't for that, then all of us would have a fairly easy time agreeing on what this verse meant. So it's primarily, at least for me, it's been primarily because of pushback. The truth is, Peter is a very foundational part of the church. And Jesus was very clear in these statements. It's upon this rock that I will build my church. So the church thing isn't about Peter. It's not Peter doing all the work or Peter getting all the glory or anything like that. Jesus is just saying, this is the role you're going to be playing for me as I build my church. As a servant, you will be the rock. You will be a foundational part of the church. It was the disciples' doctrine that did provide the foundation of the church. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, it says, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. And that fits very well as Jesus surveys Peter and this group of disciples, whose Peter is representing, by saying it's upon their doctrinal foundation that the church is built. That's true. Do you know in the Gospels, the word church is only mentioned 3 times. And each of those times it's mentioned in Matthew. And so it's mentioned here once, and it's mentioned in Matthew chapter 18 twice. And so when we look at Jesus' plan, we would absolutely say the church is Jesus' plan. But how did he work out his plan? He worked it out by training 12 men and then allowing them to teach and to form and to get this church thing organized. And so they were doing his will, but God was using them as the foundation as they did it. All right? And so Peter is a foundational part of the church. In describing the New Jerusalem, John, as he writes Revelation, chapter 21, verse 14, says, and the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So the apostles have a very unique foundational position in the church. It was Jesus' plan, and it's Jesus' church. That's how he chose to build it. This does not make Peter the first pope. And if we were to just look at all of Scripture and not just try and only form our doctrine from this one section, then we would see that clearly as well. Because after Peter's initial leadership, after he begins the church, after he opens the door of salvation to the Samaritans and then to the Gentiles, the leadership of the church was transferred from him to James. And so the first time we actually see the Jerusalem church meeting, the guy that's in charge after Pentecost, the man that's in charge is Jesus' brother, who's not even one of the disciples at this point. At this point, he's not even a believer. And so the leadership of that church, and when there's a group of leaders gathered together, Peter, at the Jerusalem council, does not take the lead. He's just one of the guys there. And so it didn't seem like he had a unique position of authority in the early church, in Jerusalem, or in any of the other churches for that matter. He was recognized as an apostle, and so he had great doctrinal authority, but he wasn't the guy who everybody thought what he says is law. It wasn't Peter. Peter's life shifts to the background of importance as we read the book of Acts. And so, yes, the first 12 chapters cover Peter's life, but the last 16, they don't. They switch to Paul. They cover his life, and they switch to the gospel going out from Jerusalem to the nations. And so Peter's not mentioned after Acts chapter 12. And finally, we find in Galatians chapter 2 a very interesting thing happening. We find there that Peter has done something wrong, and Paul corrects him. If Peter was the first pope, I wouldn't want to be Paul correcting him. I mean, if he's really the vicar of Christ on earth, if he really is the representative of Christ here, that's a guy you don't want to correct, and yet that Paul tears him apart. He says, you're not acting in accordance with the gospel. And so it seems like as you read that it is very likely, I think, that Jesus is referring to Peter as the rock. But that doesn't mean that he's the pope. It means that he had a very unique position that Jesus was granting to him, allowing him to have as he built his church. All right, that's my personality coming out, that I have to deal with all of that. That's scratching the surface. And so let's move on to verse 19. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt be loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So what does he mean here? Well, there are three ideas. He could mean evangelism. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 13, Jesus is speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees. He says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, neither suffer them which are entering to go in." And so the picture in Matthew chapter 23 is that they've locked the doors, they've bound the doors, they've shut the doors of the kingdom of heaven up. All they're doing is teaching false doctrine. And so maybe he's saying that by the doctrine you teach, by the evangelism, by the people that you go to, by opening your mouth, you are opening up the doors of the kingdom of heaven. And so that's a possibility. The second possibility is that in Jewish culture, they would often use this metaphor of binding and loosing to refer to those who taught the Torah, or those who taught the law. And so the teachers of the law were people that bound and loosed, and so maybe Jesus is just, as a Jew, working on the same metaphor, saying, it's going to be your job to teach the law or to teach the doctrines. The third possibility, and it could be all of these three together, but the third possibility, in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18, Jesus says, "Verily I say unto you, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So very similar language there. And in that case, he's dealing with church discipline. So he's saying you will have some type of authority over disciplining and running of the church. And so I think likely it's just a general statement that Jesus is making. He's not saying that Peter is going to determine or change truth. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to read this and say, well, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, and say, well, look at Peter can make the rules for heaven. He can, change what heaven thinks, and he can. It doesn't make any sense when you read all the rest. It's just a ludicrous proposition. I think what he's doing is he's saying, Peter, you need to understand your role in the future of the church, and your role will be a role of authority. It will be a role of setting things up. It will be a role of carrying out heaven's desires here on earth. And so what you do on earth is done in heaven. What's done in heaven will be done on earth. That's what he's getting at here. Verse number 20, "Then he charged his disciples that they should tell no man that Jesus is the Christ." And again, this seems strange, but it makes sense because of verse 21 and following. So he tells them, you know that you're the Christ, you know that the Son of the living God, and he says, now don't tell anybody. Well, why not tell anybody? Now they at least know who Jesus is. And the reason that he says don't tell anybody is because they know who he is, but they don't agree with what his mission is yet. So you're the Messiah, you're the one that was promised, you're the Son of the living God, but we're going to find out very quickly, but you shouldn't be going to the cross. And until they understood why he came, there was no point of them opening their mouths to tell others about him. Verse 21, "From that time forth, began Jesus to show his disciples how that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and of the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and be raised again the third day." So it's from this time forward, it's this just shift in Jesus' ministry. The whole time he's been trying to get them to see his deity, to see that he's the Messiah. They finally get it, and from this time forward, he shifts and he says, now I want to show you what's going to happen. I want to show you really why I come, why the Messiah has come. I want to show you what Isaiah 53 means. He says that he must needs be crucified. And then it's interesting that the three groups of people he talks about, he says the elders, these are the religious leaders that had dignity and respect of the people. He talks about the priests, the chief priests, who would be the Sadducees, who ran the temple and organized the sacrifices. And he talks about the scribes, who are the Pharisees, who taught the law. He doesn't specifically go to sects or groups of people. He goes to basically, between the elders and the priests and the scribes, all of Judaism. All of this whole system will crucify me. That's what's going to happen. Verse 22, "Then Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall not be unto thee." This is such a countercultural thing that Peter did here. It seems like he grabs Jesus and he says, "Be it far from thee, Lord." It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. He could not be more adamant. "This shall not be unto thee. Lord, I won't let it happen. You will not go to the cross. You will not suffer. You will not die. You will not be crucified." So what does Jesus say? "But he turned and said unto Peter, Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense unto me." You're a stumbling block. You're in my way. I have a mission and you're in the way. So get out of here. Get behind me. Get behind me is not literal. It's get far from me. You're an offense unto me. For thou savorest not. You don't care about, you don't love, you don't pursue the things that be of God, but those that be of men. And do you see this? This emotion going from Peter gets it. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God, to get behind me, Satan. You don't care about the things of God. You only care about the things of men. This up and then down. Satanically minded. And what was happening here is not that Satan was all of a sudden controlling Peter. Jesus isn't saying that there's something super demonic going on here. He's saying your mind is like the mind of Satan here. And do you remember what Satan tempted Jesus with in Matthew chapter 4? He says, you can have the kingdom and you don't need to suffer. That's exactly what Peter thought. Jesus, I'm not going to let this happen. You're the Messiah. You're the king. You will be worshipped, and you will set up your kingdom, and the world will praise you, and there will not be a cross. See, he didn't recognize the need for the cross. And so his mind was on man's things. I want to see you rule and reign, Jesus. I want that to happen now. I don't want suffering to be ahead of you. And it's like he completely misses the whole, you're going to rise again. I'm going to suffer and die and rise again. I mean, if somebody told me they were going to die and rise again, I think I'd be like, people die, why are you rising again? That's not even on Peter's mind. It's like, you're not going to suffer, you're just going to rule and reign. And so Peter, after getting it so right, here gets it so wrong. Verse 24. Then Jesus said unto his disciples, If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And this is how loving Jesus is, that as soon as this happens, he says, Get thee behind me, Satan. He's being very clear how wicked what Peter just said was. But then he takes this time to teach them and to disciple them. He says, I want you to understand how discipleship really works. And the words he says here are identical to what he already told them in Matthew chapter 10, verse 38 and 39. He says in those verses, And he that takes not his cross and follows after me is not worthy of me. He that finds his life shall lose it, and he that loses his life for my sake shall find it. Jesus said this already. But how much more of an impact would it mean to the disciples when Jesus says, I am going to be crucified. Now take up your cross and follow me. See, before it was theoretical. It was like, oh, yeah, okay, Jesus, we'll take up whatever cross you want us to bear. At that time, Jesus was performing miracles, and everything's just going wonderful. And so, yeah, okay, if following you means we'll suffer, we'll do it. And now he's saying, I'm going to be taken against my will. I'm going to be crucified. And now he says, well, take up your cross and follow me. I think it would mean a lot more. There's this ominous possibility that the disciples might literally be crucified with Jesus. And he gives them 3 statements. He says, you must deny yourself, you must take up your cross, and you must follow me. And if we could get these 3 statements ingrained into our minds, I think we'd much better understand discipleship. What does it mean to follow Jesus? It means deny yourself. It means you're following his will and not yours. It means it's not about you. It doesn't mean you purposely torture yourself or hurt yourself or put yourself through difficulty on purpose because you're hurting yourself to deny yourself. It means it's not about you. You're not even in the equation anymore. It's about somebody else's will. You deny yourself, you take up your cross. You're willing to do whatever it takes. You're willing to suffer if that's what's necessary. And you follow him. And you follow him no matter what. And you follow him no matter who's around. And you follow him no matter what it's going to cost you. You take up your cross. you deny yourself, you follow him. That's discipleship. Sounds pretty simple, right? Not. It's really hard. But then Jesus gives the motivation here in verse 25. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. You lose your life for Christ, you save it. But if you're going to try and grasp onto your life and try and do whatever you can to make this life yours and to make it worthwhile and to make it pleasurable and wonderful and fun, then you are going to lose your life. It can't be more clear than that. That is what a disciple does. A disciple is someone who believes that it's better to lose your life and to follow Christ than to save your life or to keep your life or to grasp your life and then ultimately lose it. That's a disciple. Allison and Davies said, discipleship is a doing of what is right, no matter how irksome the privations, no matter how great the dangers. We do what is right no matter what. So we look at this text and we see, I think, three things. I'll go through these three things very quickly. First thing is this. Discipleship is a roller coaster. Discipleship is a roller coaster. We see Peter's confession. He's on top of the world. We see Peter's rejection of Christ and his rejection of what Christ has come to accomplish. And this all happens in a period of 5 minutes or so. I mean, it seems almost insane. I believe you're the Christ, the Son of the living God, but I do not agree with what you say should happen, Jesus. They seem so contrary. That is our lives. We come to church and we bless the Lord, and we tell him how wonderful he is, and we believe when we say he's worth living for. And then we walk out of this place and we struggle with living out those truths the entire week long. And we say we believe that he's in control and he's a plan, and as soon as his plan doesn't go our way, we wonder what's going on. I'm not trying to make fun of you now. This is me. This is discipleship. This is how difficult this is. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's teaching Peter and he's teaching us that we can walk close to, we can know him and we can struggle. And he says, get back up. Remember that taking your life, that holding it, that following after man's desires, that's going to cost you to lose your life. But when you give your life to me, you'll find it. That's the only way to save it. And so it is a roller coaster. We might not struggle exactly in this area because we're not really telling Jesus that he shouldn't go to the cross, right? But we struggle with being a good father, saying the right things, doing the right things, not being impatient, showing love, taking the time to walk my kids through why things are the way that they are, and trying to disciple them. It's difficult. Being a good husband. We struggle with being a good wife. We struggle with the living in the relationship that God has called us to. We struggle with evangelism, with being a good testimony where we're put. We struggle with laziness. We struggle with so many things. And in all of those things, what we're truly saying is that saving my life is better. That from holding on to my life, that doing it my way is better. And Jesus would say to us as well, why do you care? Why do you savor the things of man and not the things of God? And so discipleship is a roller coaster. But you know how we start to grow and to get back to the top and to try and stay there, as long as we can? It's just to keep recognizing who Christ is and then keep believing that his way is best. The roller coaster of discipleship. Number 2, we see that discipleship has a purpose. And the purpose of discipleship, here for Peter, and I think for us as well, was to build his church with our lives. We're supposed to give our lives, right? That's what he was saying. He's saying, give your life. But then what's the whole thing about? Well, with Peter, he's saying, I'm going to build my church. That's what I'm going to do. Now, what he said to Peter is certainly different than what he said to us. But you can't read 1 Corinthians chapter 12 or Ephesians chapter 4 and not realize that you have a part in this church as well. You have a part in what he's doing in his kingdom as well. That he's given you gifts and you talents and abilities. Pastor talked about this morning to great extent, that it's so important that we are using what he's given us for his glory. Why? Because what do we do with our lives? This is his mission. His mission is to die on the cross for sinners so that he can call out a people unto himself. And now that he's called you out unto himself, you go out and be a part of that mission. There is a purpose to discipleship. The wonderful thing about the disciples is that they were not better than us. If Jesus had called the elite of the elite, how would you feel when you're called to be a disciple of him as well? Unworthy, because you look at them, but he didn't. He called fishermen, he called sinners, he called tax collectors, he called the weird people that you really wouldn't choose. And it's encouraging for us because they weren't smarter, they weren't more talented, they were not more spiritual, and Jesus used them to build this church. He'll use you too. Finally, we see that discipleship has a cost. We give our lives to the one who is worthy. We give our lives to a cause that is greater. We give our lives because we believe that eternity is real, and the best way to spend our days, right, our red rope, is in service of the King. Do you know what is neat about these verses? Is Jesus goes on, and he reminds us of eternity. And so there is this talk about giving your life, and there is sacrifice, and there is suffering. But right after that, he says in verse 26, "For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" What's the good if you do everything that is fun and wonderful and exciting in this world? You have, the life that would make anybody else envious, and you lose your soul. Obviously, there's no good in that. "For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and he shall reward every man according to his works." There is an end of the rope. And at that end of that red line, not the end of the rope, the red and the red part, there's a reward for those who spend that time in service of the King, for those who do what he's called us to do. And so there's a great motivation for us. Keep your eyes on Christ, keep serving him, keep following him, and know that he's coming back and he's going to make all things right. Peter did not understand how suffering could be a part of God's plan at this time. He did not understand how Christ going to the cross, how that made sense. He did not want there to be a cost to discipleship. And I know that if we were to ask anybody here today, you sometimes wish there wasn't. But can I tell you what Peter got to by the end of his life? 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 17. "For it is better if the will of God be so that you suffer for well-doing." Seems like a different Peter. 1 Peter 4:16. "Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf." 1 Peter 4:19. "Wherefore let him that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing, as unto a faithful Creator." There is a cost. There is a cost. But we have a faithful Creator who puts us through this. And we have this promise that he's coming back and he will reward our faithfulness. Cost. So the question for us is, are we paying it? Are we paying any kind of cost? Do any of these words seem to ring true for us? Or when he says, "You have to lose your life," I feel like I haven't really lost anything. That's not a good thing. I think this passage brings up a number of doctrinal issues, and I would enjoy talking about them all night. But I think what we need to focus on tonight is what Jesus is just teaching, how he is discipling Peter and these 11 other men. He is showing them who he is. He is asking them to be a part of building his church. He is showing them the suffering that he will endure, and he's asking them if they are willing to follow, no matter what. And I think he's doing the same thing for us today. Here he is. He's the Christ. He's the Son of the living God. You know this. I believe all of you, most of you, believe this. It's who he is. Peter got this part. He has a plan for you. So do you believe that? It's not the same as Peter's. It's not the same as mine. But he has a plan for you to be a part of his church and to build others up and to serve him in it. We already know what he's done. We know the sacrifice. We know of his crucifixion. And so finally, we need to decide if we will truly follow him, no matter what. Let's pray.